that will inform this conversation. And as you may have seen in some of our promotional materials, in terms of New England's energy imports from Canada, $10.2 billion worth of motor fuels, natural gas, other refined fuel products, and electricity annually coming into the New England states from Canada. Imagine that going up by $2.5 billion. Something I find many people, certainly around Boston, don't necessarily appreciate. 80% of our gasoline, diesel come from Canada. And of that, the overwhelming majority of the Irving refinery in St. John, New Brunswick, given where New England is relative to US refining capacity, this is our quote unquote local refinery for the New England states. And that includes 90% of Logan International Airport's jet fuel that comes from Canadian sources. And finally, on this slide, 13% of New England's net electricity comes from imports from Quebec, New York State, and New Brunswick. That's 2023 number from ISO New England. And I would just note that that's a number that may be deceptively under-impressive. It's not just the sheer number of electrons that are coming over the border, but the fact that we in New England and our friends across the border in Canada are able to count on each other for electricity in the very millisecond that you need it, which is a unique attribute of the electricity market compared to others. So it's because of this great two-way electric flow, that is what's saving us from brownouts, blackouts, or having to fire up very expensive energy resources at the last moment. I promise not to spend a lot of time on this slide. But the key numbers that I would point to here are 6 states export a lot to Canada. Should we export more? That's certainly a discussion for another day, but there's plenty going north from New England into Canada. 4 of our states, Canada is the #1 market for those states' exports. I'd note with Massachusetts, it's a quirky thing. Belgium is listed as our #1 export market because of how much we sell into the EU via Belgium and followed by China. And on the last column, take a look at the goods imported from Canada, totaling $28 billion in 2023. And just imagine what a 25% increase does to that. Finally, because I think this will come up at some point, just to level set on the issues of illegal immigration and fentanyl coming over the border. These are numbers from the US Customs and Border Protection Agency. 1.5% of quote unquote border apprehensions at the Canadian border in FY 2024. 98.5% of this issue is Mexico. Finally, fentanyl seizures at the border by CBP in fiscal year 2024. 21,148 pounds coming from Mexico, 43 pounds from Canada. 0.2% of our fentanyl problem is a Canadian problem from the American perspective. So I think it's just good to have those numbers up there as kind of a common resource for us to all look back on. And as we go to our terrific panelists, I want to start today with Patrick Woodcock, the president and CEO of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, also a former senior energy official in Massachusetts, somebody who is very knowledgeable about the economy generally and energy in particular. Patrick, from your perspective, what would you add to what you see as the risks and implications of tariffs going on Canadian imports to Maine and New England, and whatever retaliation Canada may see fit to take after that?
Well, thank you for putting this timely webinar together and for the invitation. I mean, my membership looks at Canada not only in those statistics that you illuminated is our most significant trading partner, but moreover, it is integrated in their business plans. Now, these are mills that have cross-border operations. They have made business decisions that the bedrock of which is predatory.
Anybody else finding Christopher frozen?
Patrick, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Patrick. All right, let me Patrick, we'll wait for your connection to stabilize, and we'll come back to you. Michelle Robichaux, president of the Atlantica Center for Energy. Love to hear your perspective on how you see the impacts on both sides of the border from the prospective tariffs and counter tariffs.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Thank you for the invitation today. I guess before I start into any of the official comments, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and about the cross-border energy flows. Where I grew up, my hometown, where I've raised my two kids in St. John, New Brunswick, is also home to Canada's largest refinery that you spoke of earlier, the Irving Oil Refinery. My first real job was at their head office. And not far from where my office is right now, I'm looking at the window. There are billions of dollars of crude that comes into our ports from the US by ship. And right now, because of that, there are tankers loading up 90% of the jet fuel you use in your airports, trucks heading south of the border to fuel 8 out of 10 vehicles and heat many of your homes. And that refinery is powered by natural gas, which flows through the US and to St. John. And on a personal note, I can't tell you how many summers I've spent camping and winters skiing in New England. My kids learned to love both because of how easy it is to cross that border. So when now I guess I can talk a little bit about the official business stuff. But I think it's important to bring that human element to this conversation, because at the end of the day, it's the people, not the governments, that are going to be paying those tariffs. So at the Atlantica Center for Energy, we represent some of the largest consumers, producers, and distributors of energy in Canada. Many of our center's members work on both sides of the border. And what we know from our industry in the region, that we value our connection and partnerships with the US. Collectively, I've been spending the last week talking to members of government, all of my industry members, and I know that they're working with governments on both sides of the border. It's really important, energy security and competitiveness in the region, because we are so integrated. We need to safeguard the consumers in the US and Canada, and certainly continue to provide access to reliable and affordable energy. We have an extremely interdependent relationship that you alluded to earlier. We have integrated supply chains. So in addition to crude oil and refined petroleum products from St. John, New Brunswick, you also import oil from Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore. That clean electricity flow is really important. And one thing to note is that New Brunswick is responsible for Northern Maine's grid and is the balancing authority for the region. So not too far from here, there's those switches. 95% of the natural gas that's used in Atlantic Canada comes from the US or through the US. And that being susceptible to tariffs is going to directly impact our homes, businesses, and industries that have really come to rely on using natural gas. Simply put, we're a key supplier with a proven track record to support the Northeast US energy needs. And we certainly want to maintain that energy security. At the end of the day, I guess if we look at both countries, both Atlantic Canada and the New England states face relatively high energy costs, and artificially adding to that cost doesn't really make a whole lot of business sense. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I've got a whole lot more I'm sure we're going to talk about, but just to sort of get the conversation started, I think our conversation should really be about how do we grow those exports on both sides of the border, and talk about why are we putting up these artificial barriers where we already have a mutually beneficial relationship.
Right. Patrick Woodcock, how's your Wi-Fi holding up?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, let's come back to you, and then I want to go to Christopher.
Well, thank you. No, I'll just expand on some of those comments there. We have built over decades a energy infrastructure that has 2 natural gas pipelines in Maine. We have 1 transmission line. To Michelle's point, our electric supply contracts right now in Maine are significantly embedded with cross-border electricity transactions.
I'm sorry. I think we will. We will come back to you when things stabilize. Christopher Guth is Senior VP with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And Christopher, I know we don't have you for the whole hour, but I want to first ask an economic impact question and then get to a political insight question. How's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce looking at the prospect of tariffs on Canadian imports, including energy?
Well, so for those who aren't familiar with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it's the largest trade association in the world. We represent the entirety of the economy, every size, business and sector. I say that not to brag. I say that more for empathy because it's difficult to find commonality across so many different disparate industries. But this is one where it's very easy. There's complete consensus around restraints on trade, specifically tariffs. Tariffs make things more expensive, therefore people buy less. Therefore, it's a barrier to economic growth. And the unique relationship that the United States has with Canada, it's even more. Tariffs make it even more tangible to the American consumer and Americans writ large. And President Trump was very impactful during his run for re-election, arguing that he was going to bring prices down. United States and Canada have both suffered, I won't say historic, but certainly very, very high inflation over the last 3 years. We're having a fight down here about now over the price of eggs. Perhaps in some places 40% more than they were 4 years ago. And then you look at something like a tariff, up to a 25% tariff, it's going to make so many different goods more expensive for normal average Americans. There's focus on different industries because obviously each trade relationship is different. But you look at how interdependent we are when it comes to steel and concrete. The production of vehicles are likely to go up. An area where we don't see a lot of coverage just yet, but mining and minerals. We are significantly dependent upon Canada for uranium, especially as the country looks to grow our electricity generation capacity. A lot of that's going to be hopefully going to be nuclear. And then, of course, the one that is probably the most tangible is crude oil. We are, at this point, importing more crude oil from Canada than ever before, roughly 4.5 million barrels a day. We are the largest producer in the world at about 13.5 million barrels a day, but we have a little bit of a mismatch. And this is an important point that I don't think a lot of people appreciate. We produce light sweet crude. I always make the comparison that the Canadian heavy high sulfur crude that comes out of Alberta that we import is kind of like the Budweiser of crude oils. It's not the easiest to process, but thankfully, combined between the United States and Canada, we have some of the smartest engineers in the world, and they've been able to tune our refineries specifically for that heavy crude that comes from Alberta. You might say, well, why? Well, it trades at a discount because it does take more effort, more energy to process it and refine it into the gasoline, the diesel, the jet fuel. The United States produces light sweet crude, which compared to the Budweiser, I would say is the Dom Perignon. It's very, for lack of a better word, pure, and it's easier to process. And so the United States is sitting in a very good situation, which is to say that we can export that Dom Perignon at the top level price, but we import the Budweiser at a discount, and we still make the same gasoline, diesel, jet fuel that the rest of the world makes, but we do it with a lower input cost. Point being is that if there's any tariff up to 25% on that 4.5 million barrels a day that we're using or that we're importing from Canada, then we're going to see gasoline prices, diesel prices, jet fuel prices increase in a matter of weeks, if not days. And that flies in the face of what the president ran on in reducing energy costs. And this is something that's going to happen not just, in New England, and maybe New England may even be somewhat insulated from this because of its own kind of unique geographical position. But roughly half of all of the refinery capacity in the United States is in the Gulf Coast. Most of that's in Texas. Even though the Keystone XL pipeline was never built, we still have significant amounts of crude flowing down from Alberta into the Gulf Coast, but also the Midwest. And so you're looking at more than half the country derives its gasoline and diesel significantly tied to Canadian crude production. And so they're going to see prices pop almost instantaneously. And I think that's the opposite of what the president ran on, what he's looking for.
So let me, Christopher, if I can, let me get you to pivot to the. So what do you think this is really all about from the standpoint of the president and the administration? What should Canada do about it, and what should people on both sides of the border who support this trade partnership do about it?
I think we're at the we're at the 11th hour now, so there's still some to be done, but some of this is already kind of baked into the process. The first thing I'll say is that even if there are tariffs imposed as early as tomorrow, it's not binary. It doesn't mean that they're going to last forever, and so we have to keep working this issue regardless of what happens tomorrow. I think people also need to appreciate that, Donald Trump as an individual before he was a candidate, this is the one area where he had very significant ideological thoughts. Perhaps the only area where he had a position, which is the United States is being taken advantage of. And we can all debate whether or not that's accurate or not when it relates to our trade relationship with Canada. But that's certainly what he has communicated publicly, both before he ran for office, while he was in office, and then while he was running for office again. So I think what we need to see from what he wants to see from Ottawa is action. He talks about the cross-border inefficiencies when it comes to immigration, when it comes to fentanyl. I think he needs to see a show of force. He needs to see Ottawa and perhaps even the provinces themselves step up and do something demonstrably to display that they're listening and hearing what he's talking about, even if they don't necessarily agree with the substance. And I think also one of the other things that Ottawa can do is demonstrate how this bilateral relationship can grow even more. He's been very clear that he's likely to add additional tariffs on China. And that is a growing bipartisan issue in the United States. The threat that the Chinese trade or lack thereof presents. And here's an area where Canada is uniquely situated to help us. I mean, we've already seen, I think we're up to 4 different critical minerals that China has essentially banned exports into the United States. Well, at least 3 of them Canada produces. So that's an area where we can increase that bilateral relationship in order to stay strong in the reaction to these Chinese tariffs. We're looking at the potential build out of additional nuclear generation, as I mentioned before. We don't produce a lot of uranium. We have some, but we don't produce it. Canada produces a lot of it. Canada doesn't have any enrichment capability, and Canada is looking to grow its nuclear generation capabilities as well. So that's a very obvious potential bilateral there. You have uranium, we have enrichment capacity. We both need enriched uranium for additional clean nuclear power. Something like that can be presented as a win-win and a way to potentially avoid tariffs or any other infringements on free trade.
Perfect moment, I think, to turn to our wise owl in Ottawa, Bill Prostansky with Prospective Associates, and would love to hear your reaction on sort of what do you think is really going on here, and how should Ottawa best respond.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for asking me to participate today, and welcome all those from both sides of the board that are listening. Look, my starting point is, there's two major assumptions for this discussion. One, the Canada-US relationship that we knew will never be the same. And two, globalization is dead. And look, we can talk all day about the rhetoric coming from the president, but he has, as Christopher has said very clearly, been very consistent on this. So arguing about the facts really don't win you anything. The two major issues, as we see it, of course, is one we've talked about, the border. The other is the trade deficit. And look, the president fundamentally believes that America's allies, especially the allies plus China, have been, taking advantage of America. And in Canada's case, he believes we've been getting a free ride, not only by the trade numbers, but also by the fact that we are well below the 2% and have been for a long time on spending, GDP spending on defense. And so, that's what we've got to focus on. How do we get back to a better trade balance? And how do we show the president on the border issue, which is the one that's really driving the February 1st decision? How do we prove to the administration that we are prepared to take action and take action now? And as Christopher said, not only by the federal government, but also by the provinces stepping up as well. The U.S. administration and the Congress don't really care about, pressure from Canada's interests. They only listen to U.S. voices. I mean, everyone in Massachusetts knows that, the longest uninterrupted tenure of a House Speaker, Tip O'Neill, taught us all politics is definitely local. So, Churchill said, never let a good crisis get in the way of never let a good crisis go to waste. And so Canada, this is a time for Canada to really step up. I mean, we've been talking about the productivity gains and the GDP gains that could come from inter-provincial trade barriers being taken away for decades. We were talking about that way back when I was in government, and that was a long time ago. And we haven't made a lot of progress. Well, I think now is the time to make that progress. The provinces and the federal government are meeting actually today in Toronto with the Minister Anita Anand, who is responsible for interprovincial trade, and Dominic LeBlanc, the finance minister, and the minister responsible for the Canada-US relationship, have both spoken out vigorously on the fact that we're going to make some real progress here. So let's see if the premiers react to the good things that could come out of this meeting. We need to appoint a federal border czar. I mean, President Trump looks for symbols, and we need a czar. Now, Minister of Public Safety David McGuinty, of course, is holding talks today with Homan and others. Minister Champagne, our industry minister, will be in Washington as well. But we need to name and equip a Canadian border czar with the powers to get action on the border and to show much more than the $1.3 billion plan that we've already put in place. We saw last night on Fox News, for example, how Alberta and Montana are already working together on the border. So, we have to really look at defense spending. Minister Blair has now started to talk about 2% by 2027. Well, of course, we need to demonstrate our commitment to increase defense spending during the president's term. Can't be something, off in a future president's term. We need to show commitment to building, NORAD bases in the Arctic, probably 2 of them. We need to get our icebreakers built and delivered. We need to think about how we can address the trade deficit. So, how do we increase the value of the Canadian dollar? Right now with the 25% tariffs that are potentially coming on tomorrow, our dollar is probably going to go the wrong way. So we need to take immediate action in Canada, such as I said before, the trade barriers between provinces, but we have to really figure out and make plans and on getting pipelines built east and west, getting Gateway going. Surely, if Pierre Poilievre is elected, perhaps even as early as this June, we may see that happen. He has talked vigorously about getting pipelines built in Canada. So there's lots of ways to look at this thing, but Canada has to show real action on all of these issues, and they have to do it soon, and they have to do it now. We are meeting, as you know, the ministers have been meeting with their counterparts, the incoming secretaries, but we need to show real action on many of these issues, and we need to do it now.
Very compelling to-do list, Bill. Thank you for that. And Christopher, before we lose you, we saw the Wall Street Journal report this week from very good sources that the plan may be go ahead and whack Canada with tariffs and then start negotiating, but impose the tariffs to show we are serious about this and we'll talk later. Do you see a way to head that off? And how much credence do you put in that possibility?
Well, I mean, the president himself yesterday said that this was going to be decided last night. So I suspect that the cake is baked. But we've seen different reports. We saw that report from the Wall Street Journal that specific staffers are pushing the president to throw tariffs up front and then negotiate from a place of power. And then we saw last night the Wall Street Journal also reporting that there's many in the administration trying to head this off. The bottom line is none of us know. I mean, Trump is very mercurial, and he sometimes doesn't know. He was very indifferent yesterday in what was going to happen because he hadn't gotten to that decision matrix yet, which happened presumably last night as he laid out. So, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. That's part of the strategy. Is yes. This could happen at any time, and so you know that it's real, and therefore he has that authority and leverage to argue with. It could also not happen, but you know that it's always in the background as a possibility. And I mean, there's a certain amount of genius to that strategy, even though it puts the entire global economy in question. But that's why it works.
Yeah.
Great. Patrick,
I'd just like to add there, Peter, that Peter Navarro was on Squawk Box this morning on CNBC saying that, he had read the Wall Street Journal report overnight about, the officials trying to slow this down. And his point was, he said, look, I don't have any inside information, but he said that the incoming Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, and the USTR are all at idem on this, and and whether or not energy is included is still to be decided. But he said that from his perspective, don't listen to the latest report in the Wall Street Journal. It's going ahead. Now, Canadian officials told me as late as last night that they're still talking to the administration about hoping that the announcement will be something along the lines that the tariffs will go into effect in mid-February unless Canada and Mexico do A, B, C, D, and E. And so that's their last gambit to push this off. But as Christopher says, if anybody on the panel says they know exactly what's happening, well, we know that they don't.
Yeah, Patrick Woodcock from the Maine State Chamber. I want to come back to you, and feel free to we know what you look like. We love your face, but if you need to turn off video for the sake of the Wi-Fi connection, that's fine. But would love to hear your reaction to what you're hearing so far and sense of where we are and how we get through this.
No, apologies. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, I switched computers here. So specifically, I'd say there are two aspects that I'm going to be watching. One, short term, is with electricity being included within the scope. During the winter, you would immediately start to see a reduction of Hydro-Quebec dispatch into New England. And that will put pressure on utilizing our most inefficient and most expensive fossil fuel units. But moreover, what it calls into question, if this lasts in duration, is our existing electricity supply contracts. I think there's a real question if suppliers could make a case that this is a change in law and that and this was predominantly in Maine, but I think it would have impacts across New England, that it would have a material impact on existing electricity supply contracts. The other aspect, as mentioned by Michelle, the heating oil market, there are very few refineries that are really producing this type of oil product. Heating oil in Maine is nearing $4. You don't have to be a math major to figure out what the implications would be on the heating oil market, right when we've had one of the highest heating degree days of a winter in recent memory. That is regressive, affects our most rural populations. More broadly, if this continues, I grew up in Penobscot County, Maine. We lost, over about 10 years, 5 major mills on the Penobscot River. I understand that a lot of Mainers are increasingly not producing American products and consuming more products from abroad. I understand that that's occurring in a lot of Maine counties, and I think we do need to understand that there have been trade implications on U.S. manufacturing over the last 20 years. However, what I'm concerned about with a tariff regime is a blunt instrument. And in this reshoring project, are there areas of the United States, is it New England, where the reshoring occurs in other areas of the country? And in that situation, you're left with your consumers paying higher costs and not having the dividends of a protectionist policy. I think New England is particularly vulnerable for that occurring. All of the incentives that the Biden administration put forward largely landed in the Midwest, Southeast. I think that is a harbinger to what would come with a robust protectionist policy with tariffs, especially with Canada. I'm particularly concerned what this means for New England, and acutely sensitive what it would mean for Maine if this proposal, and the scope of which encompasses the energy products we've been discussing and lasts in duration.
Yeah. Michelle, I want to come back to you and hear if I'm wondering if you see some possible rays of sunshine here, or ways we get through this together.
Well, I first comment on something that Bill had said in terms of from an Atlantic perspective versus Canada, but the Atlantic premiers have certainly been very involved in conversations with their counterparts across Canada, as well as in New England, engaging with industry and trying to sort of figure this out. So like Christopher said, we don't know what's going to happen, and we're certainly part of that Team Canada approach. New Brunswick in particular is thinking about border security. But to Patrick's point, our trade traditionally flows in the East Coast, north to south, not east to west. Right. So as much as we're looking for opportunities to trade within Canada, there's very little infrastructure that's already there. There are virtually no existing trade routes, let alone a big enough market to sort of justify expanding or creating these new trade routes. And so, if we're asking people on this call to do one thing, as I think that we need all of the leaders to be vocal about the importance and the strength of that relationship on the East Coast. We are traditionally, once again, New England and Atlantic Canada, very similar, that we don't have that political clout nationally. We're often forgot about when these big, broad scoping policies. We tend to be the ones on the East Coast that are most acutely affected. We are disproportionately, if we looked at what happened in Canada with some of the national climate change goals, and it disproportionately affected Atlantic Canada. The same thing is going to happen here. And I would say the same is happening in the New England state. If we just look at New Brunswick alone, we are the most trade exposed province in Canada, with an estimated 6,000 jobs at risk. But we don't have that political clout we don't have enough voters here in the region to make that something that is, I guess that will ring the alarm bells. Having said that, I can tell you that our premier last night, she did the State of the Province address, and certainly reiterated that we're doing all that we can to really try and understand what these tariffs are going to look like here. But there's a lot of uncertainty. Companies are moving products into the U.S. as much as they can ahead of all of this. They're expecting orders to go down, and they're planning for prices to go up. They are looking at other markets, but it's just so limited at this point in time. And that short-term piece is very different from that long-term look.
Yeah. Bill Prstansky, you alluded to the upcoming federal elections in Canada as soon as potentially June. I wonder, thinking particularly for Americans on the call, if you might just give us a view into how you see the elections playing out and how you see them on the northern side of the border potentially affecting this tariff discussion.
Sure. Look, we're into also a whole bunch of other political uncertainty in Canada because we have a prime minister who has stepped aside and his party is going through a leadership campaign, which will culminate on March the 9th. And just as an aside, this week we started a provincial election in the largest by population province, Ontario, which will conclude on February 27th. It's very likely that Premier Ford will come out of that with even more seats and even a stronger mandate. In fact, he's running on, I need a strong mandate to deal with this issue of the tariffs and the trade and the border, et cetera. So at the federal level, March 9th, we'll have a new leader. Probably 2 weeks later, we'll have a new prime minister as his cabinet or her cabinet will be sworn in. The two front runners are the former finance minister, Freeland, who was deputy prime minister and who was basically had a row with the prime minister and resigned her position, which really was the catalyst for the prime minister resigning eventually. And so that's put us in this situation. So we'll have a new prime minister. The senior federal public service is putting together a whole transition plan for either Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, who is probably the front runner right now in this. It will be between those two. And assuming Mark Carney is elected leader and becomes prime minister just before the parliament is to resume on March 24th, he won't have a seat in the House of Commons. So it may be his choice to actually call an election right away. So we could have an election as early as May, and we could have my view is that Pierre Poilievre will be elected to a majority government, and he will be probably the most transformational prime minister Canada's had since my prime minister, Brian Mulroney. So he is, obviously he calls it, he'll pass an emergency, bring it home tax cut to stimulate economic growth in the country. He will move very swiftly to eliminate barriers for interprovincial trade. And it's not just to set up trade relationships that don't exist. It's to get all kinds of freedom going on in the country. For instance, today, if you're a professional engineer in Manitoba, you work in Saskatchewan. So it's all about labor mobility. It's about a lot of issues that will lead to better productivity and an increase in the GDP. And then he's also going to approve resource and energy projects, as quickly as possible. He's already laid out a plan to repeal Bill C-69. He's expressed support for a project similar to Energy East pipeline. And so you'll see a lot of leadership by a Poilievre government and a lot of moves to bring economic growth, which we're going to need because he has also said that he would fight these tariffs, dollar for dollar, as all politicians in Canada said. And, that is good. That is good politics for sure, to stand up to President Trump and the administration by saying they're going to bring either taxes or tariffs, et cetera. But the real issue here from a public policy perspective is if, you're 1/10 the size, your taxes and tariffs that you may put on goods coming into the United States from Canada, you're not really going to have enough of an impact to really move the administration off on this. There's other issues that are probably better on the medium term at getting the administration to back off these tariffs.
We do have a good question in the Q&A from Gordon Nettleton on that exact subject. Christopher Geif laid out, how dependent U.S. refineries are on the Alberta crude. And so his question is, why wouldn't Canada just say, great, you want to hit us with a tariff? We're going to put an export tariff on the oil you need in your refineries. And I wonder how any of the three of you see that playing out as a potential strategy. Is that a way to potentially get the U.S. to back down?
Well, number one, the president last night said that he hadn't made a decision yet on energy, which mainly gives me hope that he won't. But if he does, Premier Smith has made a plea, and she's offside with all the other premiers and the federal government on this. But she really doesn't want to go in the direction of taxing oil and gas exports because look, this is our biggest economic engine in Canada. People don't realize that oil and gas exports to the U.S., it's the biggest sector contributing to Canada's GDP. Central Canadians all think it's the auto sector, but autos only generate about 11 billion a year, in contrast to oil and gas, subject to commodity prices around 150 billion dollars a year. So on top of that, the auto sector uses a lot of imported parts from the U.S., as you know. So another way of looking at it is, direct and indirect jobs, and quite frankly, 40% of the jobs generated by the energy sector and oil and gas exports to the U.S. are outside of Alberta. 40% of them are probably spread across the country. So, it's probably counterproductive. I think another way we could maybe help the Americans and the administration on looking at energy differently and not taxing or putting a tariff on our energy exports is the United States has the strategic oil reserve is unfilled, and maybe we can suggest to them that they create a strategic part of the oil reserve to be heavy oil, and that we would increase our exports and heavy oil. There's lots of ways of looking at this, but I firmly believe that putting an export tax on it would be very counterproductive, and Premier Smith has made that point very, very clearly.
Michelle or Patrick, anything to add on that question of export tariffs?
I would just add that, I think the Premier of Ontario was quoted, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight. However, I don't want a gunfight to start escalating into a howitzer fight. And I think this president would just continue to escalate. I think how it could unravel and have more consequential impacts on a long-term relationship. It is true we don't have a lot of heavy oil substitutes, although the Venezuelan market, and I would caution what that could mean long-term for refineries and what they would do over time to diversify, and what that relationship would mean for a bilateral oil market that's one of the most robust in the world.
From our part, the only thing I would add from an Atlantic standpoint is that we do import a fair amount of crude from the U.S. to refine here in the region and then send back down. So, you're increasing that cost the whole way along if there's any retaliatory measures from Canada. The other thing to include, to think about is that that two-way trade really is important. So if we look at the value of Atlantic Canada's global exports, we rely, about 17% of that is relied on from imports from the U.S. So at the end of the day, there's a tremendous amount of value in that economic two-way relationship.
Right. We have a great question from our board member, Catherine Burton, basically asking, and maybe we start with Patrick. So what do we as New Englanders try to do about this to sort of step back from this tariff war? Obviously, a lot of blue states up here, not a lot of Republicans to advocate for us in Washington. What leverage or what's our best way of standing up for continued two-way trade?
A couple points. I do think that this is more of an issue for not just New England, but all border states. So let's try to expand the number of states that are engaged in this. There are blue, red states along the US-Canada border. I also think that we need to understand that a well thought out trade policy that focuses on national security, commodities, that enhances a relationship with our closest trading partners could be very beneficial. So, I welcome a study that has been embarked with an executive order. It's this blunt, just signaling that we want to be partners with increasing U.S. manufacturing, lowering the trade deficit. Let's do it thoughtfully. I don't think that we're going to talk the president out of utilizing this tool. It's how it can be used surgically to improve the lives of Mainers that voted for him, of Mainers that are looking for hope for this economy in the second Trump administration.
Well said. And I hearken back to Christopher Guth's words about a quote complete consensus within the U.S. Chamber that impediments to trade just are not good for anybody. But Bill, Michelle, any thoughts on that question of what should we in New England be saying to Washington?
I think just from my understanding, and I'm certainly not a political analyst in any way, but the voices that resonate in Washington are the voice of business. And so I think the conversations that need to happen need to be echoed by all industry, all businesses. Send your folks to Washington, tell them the message about how any of these tariffs will resonate with your customers on either side of the border, but for Canadians to get into Washington. The other thing to remember is that we have a lot of businesses that have businesses in the U.S. that have head offices in Canada, and so we have a tremendous amount of investment in the U.S. And so that is important to recognize, and we see that value of that cross-border investment as well. And I'm not sure that, and I think Chris might have alluded to it, but I'm not sure that that's been taken into account in this trade deficit conversation.
And Bill, I'm not sure if you've got a thought on this, what you would encourage fans of U.S.-Canada trade in New England to tell Washington.
Yeah, I think if you have customers, American customers, or if you have American companies who are your customers, I think those are the people you have to invigorate into lobbying. They are much more effective, obviously, than Canadians coming down and telling our story. We need Americans to tell the story about how this will hinder their, it will cost jobs, for instance, or increase costs. The home builders, as a perfect example, they already suffering because of the softwood lumber issue, and this is going to make it even worse. So you want to get those people telling our story to American lawmakers and people in the administration. Peter Navarro said it best this morning on Squawk Box on CNBC. He said, "Look, go back and read the executive order." The America First trade policy. The president has started a consultation till April on this. So let's make sure that we have American voices telling our story and telling the story of how these tariffs are disadvantaging them. Because right in the policy, he said that he's establishing a robust, I think he said, a reinvigorated trade policy that promotes investment and productivity. Well, let's explain why these tariffs are not beneficial to that. And we have to also fundamentally realize that besides the border and besides the trade deficit, these tariffs. The reason the president believes in these tariffs and has been consistent on them, as Patrick said, or Christopher said, is because he fundamentally believes the DOGE plus the tariffs will offset the tax cuts he wants to bring in. And one of the other issues that Americans have to kind of put forward to the administration is that, I saw a poll recently, they asked, I think it was CNBC or the Wall Street Journal, someone like that asked 100 CEOs, if you had your choice, American CEOs, if you had your choice between tax cuts and deregulation, what would you choose? And over 90% of them chose deregulation. So once again, these messages from Americans into this consultative process that the executive order set up between now and April, it's really important that we get all of the Americans we know, either that we're their customers or they're ours, to get involved in this consultation and make our case for us, but by how it hinders their growth, because he's all about economic growth, the president and the administration. And so
Patrick,
we do have the opportunity.
Yeah, Patrick, I'd love to hear, as you and your main chamber members are having conversations with your congressional delegation, what's your sense of what's most resonating with Senator King, Senator Collins, your members of Congress, that they hear from your businesses, and that may offer some guidance to businesses from the other 5 states?
Well, I do think we are in a position where we have a great relationship with our congressional delegation. They want to hear from Maine employers about the consequences of any tariff proposal. I do think I would just reinforce that I do think that we have to acknowledge, my own speculation is that this is largely due to auto industry long-term trends and aftermath of the renegotiation of a lot of companies starting to position for utilizing Mexico to access the domestic auto market. And that's a real issue. I don't diminish that. But I do I think we need to understand that there are collateral damages from a scope of a tariff regime that encompasses all sectors, including energy. I think that has a real potential to undermine the inflationary pressures that have really languished in the United States, and really making that point that will exacerbate the low-income households that are really struggling with a high percentage of their disposable income dedicated to energy. This is something that ultimately I do think that the Maine congressional delegation is going to be listening to Maine businesses. I'm not concerned about that. I think we just need to make sure that the households who will be most vulnerable to these tariffs, that their voice is carried into Washington, because those are the households I'm most concerned about.
Yeah, I've gone 56 minutes without mentioning USMCA up for renegotiation next year. We've heard the president talk about maybe pushing to get that opened up sooner. Listening to all 3 of you, the one question that comes to mind is, to use Patrick's knife fight analogy, to what extent is this maybe a US-Mexico knife fight and Canada is an innocent bystander? How does that resonate with you? Maybe I'll start with you, Bill.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think the border issue is much greater at Mexico than us. We all know that. So I think in the end, Mexico should be very concerned, because this could, on the long term, USMCA may somehow disappear, and we may end up with some sort of bilateral trading arrangements between Canada and the United States. But that's maybe where this is heading. I'm not sure. But certainly the president has always, he didn't like NAFTA, but now he has his own NAFTA that he negotiated. It was supposed to be reviewed next year. He looks at a review as a total renegotiation. So I think we're into it. I know the government is preparing for it. And I know Pierre Poilievre and his people are preparing for it. And so that's where we're headed. But the problem is, Mexico, because of what you just mentioned with autos, it is going to be front and center in these negotiations. And Canada's got to make sure that they somehow come out of it in a positive way, because really the main complaints I think that the administration and the president have with the current trading relationship under the USMCA is with Mexico, not with Canada.
Yeah. Patrick and Michelle, maybe I'll phrase it in a more positive way. as you've been thinking about USMCA renegotiations next year, do you think that there are valid things that the US and Canada should revisit in a USMCA 3.0 or whatever we're up to? Are there, legitimate concerns on either side of the border that should be addressed in a new agreement?
From an energy perspective, we are so highly integrated, and we have built an energy system that crosses the border in such a way that we're quite reliant on one another. The other thing to recall or to remember is that the need for energy and the increase in energy is not going away anytime soon. There is going to be a continuously growing region, growing appetite for energy. And if we're going to develop that in a affordable way, in an energy secure way, we have to think about how our supply chains work with one another, where all that energy is going to come from. Atlantic Canada is continuing to decarbonize its grid. They're adding, hundreds and thousands of megawatts of renewable and clean energy. Was mentioned earlier around nuclear, onshore wind. We still have a tremendous amount of potential. Offshore wind is in our, relatively near future. And so certainly I think if we're looking at how do we increase the volume of energy, we have to work together. And so if we're going to study something, we need to understand where our supply chains linked, where does it make the most sense, how is it most affordably managed for the people. And so at the end of the day, the message that needs to get back is that, we have to think about who's paying for the energy and how are we going to get it to them in a safe and affordable way.
Yeah. And Patrick, next USMCA from a Maine perspective.
No, I'd just say that I don't think we're doing this issue justice to simply diminish the topic, that it's singularly a president who wants to do protectionist policies. I think in the USMCA, since the renegotiation, there has been increase in trade. There also has been an increase in the trade deficit. And I think that is a real issue that the United States, if it was similar for Canada and Mexico, they would similarly be assessing how to ensure that there's a rebalancing of trade. I think that's a real issue. And ultimately, with the advent of a new Chinese auto industry, how does that have implications with our partners in Mexico? I think these are real issues. So I do think that from our perspective, we want to singularly focus it on those topics and avoid the collateral damage that is pending, and we'll have information tomorrow of the full extent of a tariff proposal from the Trump administration.
Michelle, one question I want to direct to you. Obviously, frosty winds coming for renewable energy in the United States under the new administration, and Shell just took a $1 billion charge to walk away from an offshore wind project. How would you describe the opportunity and feasibility of energy companies that may have been looking at renewable energy in New England shifting their sights to Atlantic Canada?
Well, the first thing I can tell you is that Atlantic Canada has shown zero sign of deviating from their commitments to decarbonize the energy system. So we are still moving full steam ahead in implementing clean energy, such as Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec with their new agreement on Churchill Falls, and looking at co-developing more hydroelectric. Nova Scotia, likely within the next 10 months, will have legislation and regulation that will allow for call for bids for offshore leases in Nova Scotia. There is a tremendous potential there. What we do need is a path to market. We need people to buy the electricity. And I have it on good authority that in Nova Scotia, if you are interested in developing in Atlantic Canada and in Nova Scotia in particular, they want to meet with you. So by all means, just reach out. I'll connect you. But the other piece of it is that we have, there's been a lot of discussion in the U.S. around the IRA, and there were some recent announcements around hydrogen hubs. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I can tell you that we have a built-in producer and customer for hydrogen. So right now, the refinery in St. John, continuing to look to decarbonize, they produce a tremendous amount of gray hydrogen right now. They're looking to, clean that up. So they would be an immediate customer for clean hydrogen. We need to get off coal here in Atlantic Canada. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are the only remaining coal plants on the electricity grid within Canada. We know that that's going to be expensive. We need to figure out how to balance all of the new intermittent renewables that are coming online. So we're going to be looking for on-demand, fast-acting natural gas or dual fuel to support that. We would love to talk to any of our U.S. friends who would like to consider bringing any of that business up here in Atlantic Canada. We're definitely going to need that. We are growing, and so that need for clean energy and the move towards decarbonization is absolutely still on our radar screen.
Excellent. We have about 10 minutes before we promise to let you get on to your days. And so I think I want to turn to just, some closing thoughts from our panelists before we give it to John Gulliver to wrap everything up. Bill Prostansky, I wonder if you might sort of summarize where you think we are, especially interesting things you feel like you've heard this morning, and what comes next.
Wow. Well, what comes next? We're going to hear tomorrow what comes next, for sure. The U.S. definitely wants energy affordability at home and energy dominance in the world. And incumbent upon Canadian policymakers and politicians and business to figure out how we can feed into both. Obviously, energy affordability, if he includes energy in these tariffs, is going to take a hit. And maybe on the short term, that's a good thing, in the sense that he'll realize that these tariffs are not exactly what Americans want to see. If the price of the pumps go way up, and as some of our discussion has had today, it'll happen relatively quickly. So yeah, I think we're into uncharted waters between now and April. We're not sure if indeed the threat will actually become substantive overnight. But if it does, here we go. And I fear that we'll get into this whole knife fight analogy and not really come out of it well. I think we have to look to, as we've said here, there's a lot that Canada has to offer. With AI demanding that we in North America increase our energy, then nuclear is the only way to do it. And we have the uranium. And as was said earlier, they can enrich it. So there's trade back and forth that will be in a very positive, enlightening way. We have the potash that America needs. We have critical minerals. It's been said on the call, 3 of the 4 that China is banned going to the United States. Well, we have 3 of the 4. So we've got to get those out of the ground and to America. So, and we've got to, make good on our promises on the border. And also we've got to show a real clear path to enhancing NORAD, in getting our submarines bought, our icebreakers built, and in the water. We have to show that we are going to spend money on defending the Arctic, which is a preoccupation of the administration and the president. So these are things that we have to put on the table in a very real and substantive way to make sure that, as I think you said earlier, that we're not sideswiped by this Mexico issue that's looming larger and has a greater impact on the lives of Americans from the president's point of view. Fortress
AmCan, as some have called it. So, Patrick Woodcock from Augusta, what are you hoping we can all do in the weeks ahead around this important issue?
Well, let me just reinforce Bill's vision for a partnership. I think that alignment would bring stability to a trade partnership, but also to an increasingly challenged geopolitical situation. Let's be clear. I'm very focused to look at the scope of these tariffs. I do think that it would be beneficial to look at national security commodities. We clearly need to have not be subject to exploiting our lack of production of key commodities. I think we can do that in partnership with Canada. I think the most severe impact could be the implications on the energy markets if it's included within the scope. But let's not have no mistake. I think the main lobster industry with processing in New Brunswick have been built together in partnership with New Brunswick. Just had a trade conference in Bar Harbor. Furthermore, our forestry is a cross-border on a daily basis that can really be unlocked with hopefully a U.S. housing and Canadian housing boom that is impeding thousands of households to access. So, I do think that we should be partnering on refining this trade policy on where we think it's most productive. Just saying everything is great, I think is not actually an understanding from a lot of households in the United States, but to really have a surgical application in a way that does the least harm and then the most benefits for our biggest trading partner.
Right. And Michelle, real quick from you.
For sure. So what I could say is it's going to be uncomfortable for the next 4 years, both in Canada and the US. And we need to really understand and be clear about what that ultimate goal is. I think if we work together collectively, the voters need to understand the impact on them. So as much as we can communicate on that. And certainly, personally, honestly, I think the human side of this discussion is just as important as some of those facts and numbers. Atlantic Canada and New England are friends. And I feel more at home in Boston than I do in Toronto. So let's not forget that as we continue our advocacy. I just want to say a thank you to the NECBC. It's really important that these discussions happen, and organizations like this are really important to make that happen. I know that there's a really strong relationship between the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers. They have a Northeast International Committee on Energy. So these topics are being discussed. We just need to make sure that they hear our voices. And so I encourage everyone on this call to make sure their voices are heard in terms of the impact at the bottom line for them.
Well, you are welcome in Boston anytime, especially when the Bruins are about to beat the Leafs.
Listen, I go for the Celtics games. I'm there for the basketball. Oh, yeah.
Wonderful. So just two quick things. We have recorded this session, and everybody who's registered, you will see an email from NECBC with a link to that recording. And I had at least one person ask for the slides that we had up earlier, which I'm very happy to send around, info@necbc.org for that or any other questions. And John Gulliver, our president, let me turn it back to you for closing words and benediction.
I wish I could say Pax Vobiscum, but I'm not sure we're going to have a lot of Pax as we go out of here for the next month. Thanks to everybody, our audience, and particularly our all-star panelist crew and our moderator. A couple big takeaways, obviously. One, this market is even more tightly integrated than perhaps any of us individually had known, and this webinar pointed that out. Two, the impacts of a trade war, a tariff war, are going to be destructive on anybody and will be particularly tough, I think, on a lot of people in New England, as Patrick pointed out, just on home heating oil costs alone. Three, tariffs are at least a tool toward another end, if not an end unto itself, as Bill pointed out. So hopefully there'll be some traction on that. Finally, I think we all have crystal balls that are pretty cloudy right now. We don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of speculation. I will put all of you up on the screen in an awkward position and say, will you join us when we have a follow-up program whenever we know what the actual future is going to hold with tariff decisions, so we can bring further education to our audience, to our members, and they in turn can talk to their decision makers. I hope you will join us because we will definitely do that. And we absolutely need your insights on that. I saw thumbs up. Thank you, Michelle. Thumbs up, Patrick. Thumbs up, Bill. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend and let's sit tight. We may need our seatbelts over the next 24 to 48 hours.
And one more big thank you, Bill Prstansky and Patrick Woodcock, Michelle Robichaud, you've been terrific, and Christopher Guth earlier. Wonderful. So thankful to all of you for sharing your time and wisdom with us today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Wonderful job.